Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thank you for joining us today on Market Journal. Hey, we are powering through October, and here's hoping you've been able to get some good field work done as well. Beginning our show today, the 2020 presidential election is about 2 weeks away, and unsurprisingly, some of the issues taking center stage include the pandemic, the economy, and the Supreme Court. So when you poll the average voter, food and farming may not be very high on that list. However, Donald Trump's and Joe Biden's agricultural policies are important in how they relate to farming sustainability, healthcare, and the economy. Now, we're taking a closer look at where each candidate stands to help you make an informed decision in November. President Donald Trump or former Vice President Joe Biden? On November 3rd, the nation decides which man will be leading the country. So how would another 4 years of Donald Trump or a new Joe Biden presidency impact farmers and rural America? We'll begin with President Trump. Before taking office, he didn't know a lot about agriculture, but has surrounded himself with people who do. As president, his administration has focused on supporting agriculture through trade deals and cutting back on regulations. He's made it his mission to become an ally to farmers, even becoming the first president in almost 30 years to speak at the annual American Farm Bureau Federation meeting. If he's reelected, most expect Trump's agricultural policies to remain largely unchanged. However, the president's hardline approach with China resulted in a trade war, and he alienated some corn growers with his decisions on ethanol blending. Joe Biden's official website offers the Biden Plan for Rural America, which includes building a pathway to the middle class. If elected, Biden promises to strengthen the ag sector through farm-friendly trade policies, supporting new farmers, and improving health care in rural communities. Biden says he sees rural America as essential to the success of our country. He pledges to expand access to broadband, ensure high-quality education in rural schools, and promote environmental sustainability. The Biden administration would also work to help U.S. agriculture achieve net zero emissions and compensate farmers for doing so. You can read more about Donald Trump's and Joe Biden's plans for agriculture on their official websites. And on the Market Journal website, we've included a link to a list of agriculture-related questions that the American Farm Bureau Federation posed to each candidate. Next up, at this rate, harvest will be over before you know it, but a farmer's work is never over. There are several other tasks to complete post-harvest, and one important step for crop producers to take is weed management. Market Journal's Bill Dodd recently caught up with Nebraska Extension Weed Management Specialist Amit Jhala to find out more about Marestail management.
As the combines take their last pass through the field and the grain carts have finished filling the trucks, it's time for the work to continue. Many winter annual weeds can pose problems in the field come springtime. However, Marestail can be an especially troublesome weed for many producers to control. Scouting should be done in the fall as well as early spring in order to formulate an effective management strategy.
Marestail is a broadleaf winter as well as summer annual weed species, and the leaves are small, alternate, and one typical character of Marestail is it can form a rosette in the fall that can overwinter. So this is a typical character of Marestail compared with any other winter annual weed species.
Marestail usually exhibits rapid growth and is aggressively competitive with other crops for water. Amit warns that failure to properly suppress the weed could result in devastating yield loss.
It is a very competitive weed and it can grow large, up to 1 meter tall, even in presence of crop species like particularly soybean. It is very competitive and it can cause yield reduction in the range of 50 to 75% if it is not controlled. So when Marestail is relatively small, like less than 1.5 inch or 2 inch tall, that is the best way herbicides will be more effective compared with, as I told you, if they can overwinter in rosette form, and once they grow, emerge in early spring, then they can grow really tall, and it will be more difficult to control when you will try with some post-emergence herbicides after planting crops. So the best way is to control them in the fall. And with some reason, if growers are not able to control them in the fall, then the alternate strategy will be just to try something early spring.
Mare's tail can be particularly challenging to round up because this plant can produce up to 200,000 seeds, of which about 80% can germinate immediately after being expelled from a mature plant. To make matters even worse, this plant is the first glyphosate-resistant weed reported in the United States.
Marestail is difficult to control because it has evolved resistant to glyphosate as well as some ALS inhibiting herbicides. So majority of Marestail in Nebraska, I would consider them as a glyphosate resistant, and that's why we have to use some alternate herbicide programs. For example, in the fall, growers can consider using herbicides that contain either 2,4-D or dicamba, or maybe paraquat if weather conditions are better. So there are 3 dicamba products that were labeled in soybean. They cannot be used now because of the cancellation of their registration, and that includes hexapan, Engenia, and Extendimax. But you can use some other available dicamba formulations for controlling Marestail in the fall. So growers have to use some alternate herbicides other than glyphosate because majority of them are glyphosate resistant.
While herbicide options may be limited, there are still some alternatives. While it's not typically recommended to implement residual herbicides in the fall, as it happens, many producers in the state are ahead of schedule on harvest, and this could be an advantageous time to utilize these applications if the target happens to be mare's tail.
Generally, we do not recommend to apply residual herbicides in the fall because we cannot take much advantage of residual activity, especially when harvest is late and then emergence of Marestail is late. But if harvesting was done early, and if you see a lot of Marestail is coming up in the field, then there is a value to use some residual herbicides, for example, sulfentrazone or flumioxazine based herbicides like herbicide active ingredients in Authority or Valor or Fierce type of herbicides can be applied in the fall, but only when Marestail infestation is very high. Otherwise, I would keep those residual products to be applied in early spring so growers can take advantage of their residual activity late in the summer.
It seems that the no-till crop production systems adopted over the last couple of decades have bolstered the propagation of mare's tail. Given the plant's stubborn nature, Amit suggests an integrated approach be taken under consideration.
See, if growers are considering to control Marestail in the fall, then they can consider some other practices. For example, tillage can also help. Some of the studies we conducted at UNL says if you can just till the soil in top 10 centimeter area, like about 2.5-inch deep tillage can also reduce significant Marestail emergence in early spring. So tillage is one of the practices, and cover crops can also help to suppress Marestail emergence in the fall as well as in the early spring. So integrated approach has to be considered when you control Marestail, and especially in non-crop areas, you will have more options for controlling Marestail because there is no crop, and that will increase your herbicide options. But when you have a corn or soybean or any other crop, then you have to consider Marestail control practices either in the fall or in the early spring before you go for planting your crops.
Once the last load has been hauled in, it's time to get back in the field and make sure problems like mare's tail don't sneak up on you come spring. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. One final consideration for you. Amit stresses that fall herbicide application should be the go-to option in this case, as weather conditions could frequently interfere with early spring applications. Time for markets now, and the recent USDA grain stocks and WASDE reports lowered corn and soybean inventory levels well below pre-report expectations, shocking the markets and leading to a sharp price rally. Now, with harvest in full swing for many producers, we're keeping an eye on what's next and how this might impact your agricultural decisions. Scott Brown, ag economist from the University of Missouri, joined me on Wednesday to discuss what we've been seeing in the markets since the USDA news broke.
You know, Troy, we've really tightened up on the corn markets here over the last couple of months. If you look at what USDA is now projecting that will go out of the end of this current marketing year with, you know, we're 600 million bushels below where we would have been back in August. So the markets have tightened a lot. We've seen futures markets that have moved up 75 cents or so over the last 60 days. To me, I think as we look forward, this is still going to be one of, does the crop continue to shrink? We haven't seen a lot of yield cut from USDA yet, although they did trim acres by 1 million with the last WASDE report, and I think that has a lot to do with some of the FSA data that's recently been out. So a much different situation than where we would have been just 60 days or so ago. I do suggest that perhaps markets are getting a little bit overheated relative to what the current situation looks like.
And in the past, when the USDA makes adjustments like this, is there anything we can expect? Because, I mean, we've seen the price rallies, but are there any other things history tells us that producers can plan for to maybe be ahead of the curve?
Well, I keep suggesting risk management is so critical in this period of time. And I think here's another case where with the rally that we've seen, I hope folks are pricing some of that new crop corn. I'm not saying that we're absolutely going to fall from these current levels, but I think prices are at levels that give us some reasonable return. And I hope folks will get a little bit of the risk out of the system for them as you know they're able to price. So I think there's opportunities here. And again, I worry there is downside risk in all of these ag markets when you think about how COVID-19 has been impacting us generally.
And then, Scott, yeah, this impacts other markets too. We always like to talk livestock with you. What advice do you have for the cattle producers who are having to make feeding decisions and figure out their input costs?
So I think they should plan for higher feed costs. You know, for a while to them always been saying, hey, we have feed costs at levels we haven't seen for a long time. Let's make sure we lock in some lower feed costs. I might be a little less interested in that right now, especially on the corn front. I hope we get maybe some break on feed costs for cattle producers. But I keep saying, I worry about the downside risk. Not that we're going to necessarily see it, but to me, there's a lot of downside risk related to how COVID-19 affects us longer term.
And with beef demand, is it still going strong in spite of all the disruptions still happening in the country?
Amazing how well it has been going thus far. And I go, let's just hope we continue down that road. I, again, worry that at some point consumers look in their pockets one day and don't have as much money. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with what kind of federal stimulus we see going forward. We know we've had issues getting any kind of additional federal stimulus done to this point, but I'm wondering if we won't see another round once we get beyond current elections. But a 10% cut in the economy, which is what we're really suggesting, plus or minus here for 2020. To me, that suggests some weaker demand for meat products longer term, and we just haven't really seen that yet. In fact, we've seen the opposite, strong demand. And I don't want us to forget that traditionally a weak economy is not always so good for us in terms of meat demand.
And Scott, talk to me about the hog market too, maybe a little more touch and go than with beef. Where do you see this market going as we move into the fall and into the winter?
So I, again, will say I'm worried about the downside risk in hog markets. For me, a little different than cattle in that we've got to have big runs of hogs. We're going to have to slaughter 2.7 million head a week here through the remainder of the year just to kind of keep up, if you will, with what's going to be the supply of hogs. So plentiful supplies. Domestic demand's been good. When you look at what wholesale pork prices have done, they've done nothing but gone up over the last 60 days or so. I think we need strong export demand, and I think we've seen that as well. But with the growth in supplies that we see, again, if we get any hiccup on the demand side, I think we could unravel some of this recent strength pretty quickly on the hog side of the equation.
And then with African swine fever, maybe not getting as much talk since COVID has been going on, but tell us the latest on ASF around the world.
Yeah, so I think ASF has actually been really helpful for U.S. markets here over the last 60 days as well, with Germany having ASF cases in the wild boar population there. It has shut them out of some of the markets that I think we've been able to gather some export strength in. It reminds me to say, here in the U.S., if we were to have an ASF outbreak, again, I worry that would come in the wild population is how it would start to unfold here in the U.S. That's not a great scenario. Don't really affect domestic supplies, domestic pork supplies, yet you're likely shut out of export markets. If the United States were to be shut out of export markets right now, not a scenario we want to talk about. And so Germany gives us a good example of what I think could unfold in the U.S. Keep it in the wild population and it never gets in the domestic population at all. It's still not a very good situation. Now, I think you look at China, also some stories beginning to come out of additional incidents of ASF. To me, that's all good news for U.S. pork exports, but we sure don't need ASF to come here in the U.S.
Next week, we'll be joined by Frayne Olson from the University of North Dakota. Next up, for many in western Nebraska, the dryland rotation is one of compromises, dominated by wheat, corn, fallow. This leaves residue to hold moisture and fight weed pressure, but it also leaves an entire year between corn harvest and winter wheat planting. That's why some growers in the southwest part of the state are turning their attention to spring wheat. Researchers at UNL conducted a trial this year at the Stump Research Center in Grant to evaluate different spring wheat varieties as well as different practices and their effect on yield. Read about these trials in the October Nebraska Farmer. Let's get a check on the weather now with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. And Al, these 80-degree temperatures have been nice, but do we now need to be getting ready for some cooler temps?
Yes, Troy, we have seen a little bit of cool weather. It might be a sign of things to come. It does appear that we're going to be dealing with a little bit of more of this Arctic air coming into our region over this next week. A couple shots look to be in the cards. Before we get to that main forecast, of course, CPC, the Climate Prediction Center, released their official winter forecast for the months of December, January, February. And the key highlight is that below normal temperatures that were encompassed in the northern plains have been shifted a little bit toward the east and toward the south from the previous month, which was last month. And in terms of precipitation, a wide band of above normal precipitation across the northern 1/4 of the country, basically across the Dakotas, and then dipping that down into the Great Lakes region. For us, unfortunately, no real significant precipitation trend is in the forecast, but the cold weather does look to be on the way. So let's get right to the forecast and see how this may portend as we go through this next 7-day period. As you can see from today's upper air pattern, we have a trough over the northern plains that is expected to dive toward the south and southeast over the next 24 hours. We have a cold front line across the southern South Dakota that is expected to move through the state during the overnight hours, pushing high pressure from Montana into our region as we go into tomorrow. So we see the snow lining up across the northern plains, and that is expected to push southward, giving us a chance of light rain and snow flakes during the overnight hours before clearing out during dairy bake. Most of the cold air moves to the east as high pressure firmly in control. It's going to be a very cool, raw day on Sunday, basically looking at low 40s to upper 40s across the state. You can see there's that precipitation skirting through during the morning hours. And then as we get into Monday, we start to see some relaxation of that trough. Might be bumping our temperatures about 5 degrees across the state. We're still going to be stuck in the 50s pretty much statewide. Most of the precipitation will shift to our southeast. More importantly, as we get into Tuesday, we start to see another piece of energy that wants to move through this flow, really just a reinforcing shot of cool air to keep temperatures basically stable in the mid 50s. High pressure moves across the Dakotas. This is a very dry air mass, so most of the precipitation, of course, will remain well to our north as we remain in this persistently dry pattern. Now on Wednesday, we start to see a flattening out of that troughing pattern, so we're going to get more of a zonal flow. Low pressure tries to develop in this northeastern Colorado. There's just no moisture for it to work with. So we'll see an increase in temperatures back to closer to normal into the low to mid 60s, with most of precipitation over the Great Lakes. And then another surge of cool air tries to come in on Thursday. Most of that is directed toward the northern plains in northwestern Nebraska as high pressure starts to filter in. Again, not much in the way of precipitation, as most of that precipitation is expected to move along the front to the south of Nebraska and up toward the Great Lakes. And as we get into the day on Friday, we start to see that trough lifts out. Much warmer conditions look to be in store as we get on the backside of that high pressure and brings us back up into possibly the 70-degree mark across the state. As you see, the snow accumulation looks like it's going to be into the eastern Corn Belt. More importantly, as we go farther down the line, which takes into consideration next Thursday to the following Tuesday, we look like we're below normal temperatures, and that is because another piece of energy looks like it's going to come into our region next weekend. This one has a pretty good shot of cold with it. If it comes in a little bit farther toward the west, and we would see a better precipitation regime across western Nebraska. But right now, the models aren't too particularly encouraging in terms of moisture. We see that most of the significant above normal moisture associated with this system will remain well to our east, with below normal or precipitation in the west that will start to move toward our region and bring a nice warming trend, it looks like, for the end of the month. So Troy, overall, it looks like we're going to see very cool temperatures, more remnants of what we would expect during the fall, maybe a shot of snowfall, very light at that. But more importantly, it looks like we're setting a trend up. And if the La Nina forecast itself is accurate, probably going to see some very cold conditions during the first half of the winter with many of these Arctic surges. So this is our taste of it. Enjoy this little cool weather. The warm air will return in earnest at the end of the month.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, last week, Nebraska Research Assistant Professor Katja Koehler-Cole discussed her research with cover crops in corn. This week, she's back to discuss a similar project, but this time in soybeans.
We've been growing cover crops in these plots since 2014, and one of the things we're interested in is how cover crops influence the abundance and diversity of soil microbes. If you can look down here, this is a plot that is a control plot, so we have not grown a cover crop in here. The top layer of the soil is pretty dry. We've had a very dry August. The top layer of the soil is also where most of our soil microbes live. They're probably in the top 3 to 4 inches is the majority of the soil microbial life on Earth. So it does make sense to give them, if we can, the best possible growing conditions, which would be moderate temperatures and food and shelter, of course. And cover crops are one reason that we can do that in our crop fields. This was a cereal rye cover crop that was terminated in early May of this year, and then soybean were planted right away. It was basically a green planting. So you can still see a lot of the cover crop stems. It's noticeable that almost all of the soil is covered. That made a big difference, especially at the beginning of the season when the soybean are still small. So that residue really helps prevent erosion. It keeps the soil cooler and more moist. So cover crops are especially useful if we're growing them during a time when there's no other crop in the soil. So in our corn-soybean rotation, that would be after the harvest of, for example, corn until the planting of the next corn or soybean crop. And winter cover crops such as cereal rye or hairy vetch are both pretty useful. When they're in the ground, they provide food to microbes. Microbes' preferred food source are the simple sugars and amino acids that are leaking from plant roots. If we have a living plant in the ground, we're providing both food and shelter for soil microbial communities. We're using a test called phospholipid fatty acid, or short PLFA analysis. We're having it analyzed at a local lab. For this test, we're just taking the upper 4 inches of soil, and this is really difficult right now because the soil is very hard. I'm putting this in a Ziploc bag. The soil has to be either taken to the laboratory right away, or if you can't do that, it's best to freeze it. This PLFA test gives us some idea about the different microbial groups. They are the ones that break down simple organic materials such as fresh leaves. If soybean leaves fall down, they can easily degrade that, or if we have a fresh young cover crop, they are degrading things like that. Fungi are another group that we are interested in and that we are hoping to increase with a cover crop. Saprophytic fungi are the ones that are the decomposers. And another important group of fungi are arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, or AMF fungi for short. So they help plants access nutrients in the soil, such as phosphorus or even water, that the plant roots themselves can't get to. And they can colonize, for example, a cereal rye cover crop. And then when a corn crop is planted, they can go from the cereal rye and colonize the corn crop. So really, with a cover crop, we're kind of providing sort of a bridge or an alternative host to the AMF fungi. What all fungi do is they're hyphae, they're very thin, thread-like structures. They reach out in the soil, they are the ones that, I guess, forage for nutrients, and they excrete a glue-like substance called glomalin, which helps bind soil particles together and form soil aggregates. In our research in these plots here, we've been growing cover crops continuously for 4 to 5 years now. The soil is very dry. Again, we had a very dry August, but we have found in our research that we have seen improvements in soil aggregation. Cover crops can help our microbial communities, which in turn is very important for our soil structure.
You can check out part 1 of our story with Katja, where she discusses cover crops and corn, on the Market Journal website and YouTube page. And if you'd like more information on her research, she's written several articles which can be found at cropwatch.unl.edu. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. Don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. And we hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.